You're walking through the marble halls of a wealthy Athenian household in 420 BC, and you witness something that would make your blood run cold in the modern world. A teenage girl, barely 14 years old, is being prepared for her wedding night with a man 3 times her age, a man she's never met, never spoken to, and will have no choice but to obey for the rest of her life. But this isn't just another arranged marriage. What you're about to discover represents some of the most shocking and systematic cruelty toward women in human history, hidden beneath the polished facade of classical Greek civilization. Before we dive into these forgotten truths about ancient Greece, if you're interested in learning about the darker sides of history that textbooks often gloss over, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it fascinating that we can explore these ancient stories together from all corners of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of historical oppression. This is the story of how an entire civilization built its foundation on the systematic dehumanization of half its population, creating sexual taboos and social structures so brutal that they would shock even the most hardened observers today. The Greeks may have given us democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games, but they also perfected forms of gender-based cruelty that haunted Mediterranean culture for centuries. Let's start with a truth that would shatter most people's romantic notions about ancient Greece. When we think of classical Athens, we imagine philosophers debating in marble courtyards, citizens participating in democratic assemblies, and artists creating masterpieces that still inspire us today. But this golden age of civilization was built on the backs of women who lived lives so restricted and dehumanized that they were barely considered human beings. The moment a Greek girl was born, her fate was sealed in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend. She wasn't seen as a future citizen, a potential philosopher, or even a complete person. She was viewed as a temporary burden on her father's household, a mouth to feed until she could be transferred to another man's property through marriage. Ancient sources describe newborn girls being examined not for their health or potential, but for their likelihood of attracting a suitable husband someday. From the earliest age, these girls were trained in what Greeks called sophrosin, a concept that roughly translates to self-control, but really meant the complete suppression of any independent thought, desire, or personality. They learned to walk with downcast eyes, speak only when spoken to, and never, under any circumstances, express an opinion about anything more complex than household management. The goal wasn't education or personal development, it was the creation of human beings so thoroughly broken that they would never question their status as property. But perhaps most disturbing was how Greek society justified this treatment through elaborate mythologies and philosophical frameworks. The Greeks didn't just oppress women, they created an entire intellectual system to explain why this oppression was natural, necessary, and even beneficial. Aristotle himself argued that women were essentially defective men, lacking the rational capacity for true virtue or wisdom. This wasn't just casual misogyny, it was systematic dehumanization, dressed up as scientific observation. The sexual taboos surrounding Greek women were so extreme they make medieval convents look liberal by comparison. A respectable woman was expected to remain completely ignorant about her own body until her wedding night. And even then, sexual education consisted of being told to submit silently to whatever her husband demanded. The very idea of female sexual pleasure was considered not just inappropriate, but actually dangerous to social order. Ancient medical texts describe women's bodies as fundamentally flawed and unstable, prone to hysteria if not properly controlled by male authority. The word hysteria itself comes from the Greek word for uterus, reflecting their belief that women's reproductive organs made them inherently irrational and potentially violent. This wasn't just ignorance, it was weaponized pseudoscience designed to justify treating half the population as mentally defective. What makes this even more chilling is how thoroughly these beliefs penetrated every aspect of Greek culture. Their greatest playwrights wrote tragedies celebrating women who destroyed themselves rather than live with dishonor. Their historians recorded the deeds of kings and warriors while treating women as footnotes in their own stories. Even their goddesses, supposedly powerful divine beings, were often portrayed as jealous, vindictive creatures whose emotions constantly threatened cosmic order. The marriage customs alone reveal the depths of this systematic cruelty. Greek girls were typically married between the ages of 12 and 15, not to young men learning about love and partnership, but to established men in their 30s or 40s who already had clear expectations about their new wife's role. The wedding ceremony itself was less a celebration of union than a ritualized transfer of property from father to husband. On her wedding day, a Greek bride would be bathed, dressed, and adorned like a valuable object being prepared for sale. She would be handed over to a man she might have seen only once before in a ceremony where she had no voice, no vows to make, and no opportunity to refuse. The marriage contract was negotiated entirely between men, with the bride's preferences, assuming anyone cared to ask about them, completely irrelevant to the proceedings. But the wedding night represents perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this entire system. These teenage girls who had been kept in complete ignorance about sexuality were expected to submit immediately and without question to husbands who viewed them as both property and sexual objects. There was no concept of consent, no gradual introduction to intimacy, no consideration for the girls' feelings or fears. Ancient sources describe wedding nights where brides were essentially assaulted by their new husbands, with this violence considered not just normal, but necessary for establishing proper marital hierarchy. The aftermath of these traumatic beginnings set the tone for entire lifetimes of subjugation. A Greek wife was expected to produce children, preferably sons, while maintaining complete invisibility in public life. She couldn't own property, couldn't vote, couldn't participate in religious festivals, and couldn't even leave her house without her husband's explicit permission. Her entire existence revolved around serving male needs while suppressing every aspect of her own identity. Perhaps most tragically, this system was self-perpetuating in ways that ensured its continuation across generations. Women who had been broken by this treatment often became its most vicious enforcers, teaching their daughters that resistance was futile and submission was the only path to survival. Mothers would prepare their young daughters for lives of degradation, viewing this preparation not as cruelty, but as necessary education for the realities they would face. The few women who managed to achieve any kind of independence, usually through widowhood or exceptional circumstances, were viewed with deep suspicion by Greek society. Female merchants, priestesses, or intellectuals were often accused of being sexually promiscuous, mentally unstable, or under the influence of dangerous foreign ideas. Any woman who demonstrated capability or intelligence threatened the fundamental assumptions on which Greek civilization was built. What's particularly disturbing is how Greek men convinced themselves that this system was actually beneficial for women. They argued that protection from the corrupting influences of public life allowed women to maintain their natural purity and virtue. They claimed that sparing women from the burdens of decision-making and responsibility was actually a form of kindness. This wasn't just oppression, it was oppression wrapped in the language of care and protection. The sexual double standards were so extreme they bordered on the surreal. While wives were expected to remain completely chaste and faithful, Greek men routinely engaged with prostitutes, slaves, and even young boys without any social consequences. Adultery was defined entirely from the male perspective. A married woman having relations with any man other than her husband faced potential death, while married men could have sex with anyone except other men's wives without breaking any moral codes. The psychological warfare didn't end with marriage. Greek society developed elaborate systems to ensure that women never developed any sense of self-worth or personal agency. Religious festivals, which should have provided some respite from domestic imprisonment, were carefully structured to reinforce female inferiority. Women could participate only in rituals that emphasized their roles as mothers and wives, never as independent spiritual beings seeking their own connection with the divine. The most insidious aspect was how thoroughly this dehumanization penetrated women's own self-perception. Ancient sources describe Greek women who genuinely believed they were intellectually and morally inferior to men. They internalized the mythology of their own defectiveness so completely that many actively resisted any suggestion that they deserved better treatment. This wasn't just oppression imposed from outside, it was oppression that had colonized their very souls. But perhaps nothing illustrates the depths of Greek cruelty toward women more clearly than their treatment of female sexuality itself. While modern societies struggle with sexual education and consent, the Greeks went far beyond mere ignorance. They actively cultivated female sexual trauma as a tool of social control. Young wives were deliberately kept terrified of their own bodies, taught to view sexual desire as a dangerous sickness that could destroy their families and communities. The medical theories surrounding female sexuality reveal a level of systematic psychological abuse that's hard to comprehend. Greek physicians taught that women's bodies were essentially unstable vessels, constantly threatening to overflow with dangerous passions that could drive them to madness or violence. Sexual satisfaction was considered not just inappropriate for women, but actually harmful. They believed that female orgasm could cause mental illness, infertility, or even death. This created a nightmarish situation where Greek wives were expected to participate in sexual relations, while simultaneously being taught that any pleasure they experienced was evidence of moral corruption. Imagine the psychological torture of being forced into intimate situations while believing that your natural responses made you evil or sick. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe sexual trauma, but Greek society interpreted their suffering as proof of inherent female weakness rather than evidence of systematic abuse. The economic dimensions of this oppression were equally brutal. Greek women existed in a state of permanent financial dependency that made escape impossible even for those who recognized their situation's cruelty. They couldn't inherit property except under extraordinary circumstances, couldn't engage in business transactions, and couldn't even control money given to them as gifts. Every aspect of their material existence was mediated through male relatives who could withdraw support at any moment. This economic helplessness created a form of psychological terrorism where women lived in constant fear of abandonment or rejection. A wife who displeased her husband could find herself returned to her father's household in disgrace, if her father would even accept her back. Divorced women became social pariahs, viewed as damaged goods who had failed in their primary function. Many preferred to endure horrific abuse rather than face the complete social annihilation that came with marital failure. The few outlets available to Greek women were carefully controlled to channel their energies toward serving male interests. Women could excel at weaving, cooking, and household management, but only because these skills made them more valuable as wives and mothers. They could participate in certain religious observances, but only those that reinforced their subordinate status. They could form friendships with other women, but only under circumstances where their interactions could be monitored and controlled by male authority figures. Even motherhood, supposedly the one area where women held some power and respect, was structured to minimize female agency. Greek mothers were expected to love their children, but this love was supposed to express itself through absolute obedience to paternal authority. A mother who tried to protect her child from an abusive father was viewed as undermining the natural order. Women were taught to see their children not as individuals they were nurturing, but as products they were creating for male approval. The educational system reinforced these patterns from the earliest ages. While boys learned rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and athletics, girls learned only the domestic skills necessary to serve their future husbands. But this wasn't just a difference in curriculum, it was a deliberate cultivation of intellectual helplessness designed to ensure that women never developed the critical thinking skills that might lead them to question their treatment. The most chilling aspect of Greek women's education was how it trained them to police each other. Older women became enforcers of the same systems that had destroyed their own lives, viewing younger women's struggles not with empathy but with resentment. They had suffered, so others must suffer too. This created a culture where women's greatest enemies were often other women who had internalized their own oppression so thoroughly that they couldn't imagine any alternative. What makes studying this historical period so disturbing isn't just the individual cruelties inflicted on countless women. It's recognizing how these patterns established templates that influenced Mediterranean cultures for centuries afterward. The systematic dehumanization perfected by the Greeks didn't disappear with the fall of Athens. Instead, it was absorbed, refined, and transmitted through Roman law, Christian theology, and eventually into the legal and social structures that shaped European civilization. The Greeks created more than just individual suffering. They created institutional frameworks for turning human beings into objects, for transforming love into ownership, and for disguising cruelty as virtue. Their philosophers wrote elaborate justifications for treating women as subhuman. Their playwrights celebrated stories of female destruction, and their historians recorded these patterns as natural and inevitable, rather than as choices that could have been made differently. Perhaps most tragically, we can trace direct lines from Greek attitudes toward women to practices that persisted well into the modern era. The legal doctrine that wives were their husband's property, the medical theories that pathologized female sexuality, the educational systems that deliberately cultivated female ignorance, all of these have roots in the systematic cruelties perfected in ancient Athens and Sparta. Understanding this history isn't just an academic exercise, it's recognizing how deeply embedded patterns of oppression can become, how they can disguise themselves as culture, tradition, and even philosophy, and how they can persist across millennia through institutions that present themselves as civilized and enlightened. The story of ancient Greek women forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human civilization, that some of our most celebrated cultures were built on foundations of systematic cruelty that we're only beginning to fully understand. When we admire Greek architecture, philosophy, and art, we must remember that these achievements came at the cost of countless women who lived and died as property, never knowing freedom, never experiencing genuine choice, never being allowed to discover who they might have become. These weren't isolated incidents of individual cruelty. This was an entire civilization that perfected the art of human degradation and convinced itself it was virtue. The Greeks didn't just oppress women, they created intellectual frameworks that justified this oppression for centuries to come, influencing legal systems, religious doctrines, and social structures that persist in various forms today. Perhaps the most haunting realization is how thoroughly these women's voices have been erased from history. We know the names of Greek philosophers, politicians, and playwrights, but we'll never know the names of the teenage girls who were destroyed by this system, the mothers who watched their daughters' spirits broken, or the countless individuals who might have contributed something remarkable to human knowledge if they'd been allowed to exist as full human beings, rather than as objects serving male convenience. Their stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of how quickly civilizations can convince themselves that cruelty is kindness, that oppression is protection, and that systematic dehumanization is the natural order of things.